let's talk politics for a minute. Now, this is not a topic that I'm probably going to cover a lot on here. I personally don't care for politics very much. It tends to frustrate me. It tends to get stressful, and it tends to end up in fights really, really quickly. And so I'm usually just pretty happy not to go there. But in the US, we are gearing up for our elections, and it is everywhere. And as much as I would like to just kind of put my fingers in my ears and just wait for it all to be over, there's a pesky little passage in 1 Timothy that I would like to invite you into with me, that I'm wrestling with before the Lord, because I want to get a hold of this the way that the Lord has spoken about it and the way he would like his people to actually participate. So 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 to 2, "Therefore I exhort first of all that supplications, prayers, intercession, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence, desiring that prayers, supplications be made for all, for kings and for those who are in authority." Now already, this is kind of getting at that retreat mode where I want to just go la la la, I'm going to pretend like none of that's happening, but God desires that we as believers would pray for kings and for those who are in authority. What makes this extra interesting, though, is to look at the time this was written, who was writing it, and why. Well, most of us know that this is one of Paul's epistles written to Timothy, and at the time they're of course living in the 1st century. Timothy's living in Ephesus. Paul has recently-ish been released from arrest in Rome. He's traveling, we're not quite sure where, because this is beyond the span of the book of Acts, but they're in the Roman Empire. And at this point in history, the emperor, the king, the guy that Paul just urged Timothy and his church to pray for, was Nero. Yep, that Nero. Yes, the watch Rome burn and then blame it on the Christians Nero. The throw Christians to the lions and burn them alive on crucifixes to light up his garden parties Nero. Now that persecution of the church wouldn't happen for another couple of years, most likely. That was in AD 64. This was probably written between AD 62 and AD 64. But even before Nero started doing that, he wasn't exactly the most stable, rational, benevolent guy. Like, there is no world where you would want Nero or a person like Nero to be your king. Now this brings it back to us. I know that these are very contentious elections, and there are pretty deep divisions on both sides of the political aisle in terms of who is the best candidate for the job, who should you vote for, who does a better job standing up for justice, who's going to bring a solution to the economy, who's godly, who's smart, and everyone has different ideas about how these different men and women will stack up to the job of being the president. And I mean, obviously none of them are the president yet, but barring something incredibly unexpected, one of them will be. Looking at just how divided the country is, there are going to be a lot of people really disappointed with who gets elected. There are going to be a lot of people in the church really disappointed about who gets elected, because a lot of us are all over the place politically too. And I mean, that's fair enough, because it's not exactly like there is one clear God's man or woman for the hour who will be the best of the best and the godliest of the godliest. I mean, we've just kind of got to pray and make do with what's there. But as we do that, I mean, firstly, that's a good opportunity to check, okay, how much are we putting our faith in God in this election season, and how much are we putting our faith in a good candidate? Like, how much do we think that the right person in the Oval Office can deliver our country from itself? And how much do we think God is the only one who can deliver our country for itself. So that's kind of, personal heart check number 1. Personal heart check number 2, as we're talking about these candidates and having strong feelings, which isn't in and of itself a problem, like as much as I'm frustrated with the political process at the moment, and I'm not nuts about a lot of the candidates, there are ones that I would feel more reluctance to see them take office than others. But when somebody gets elected, that is the person who is now governing our nation. Look back to what we talked about recently with Daniel 2. This is somebody that God has actually raised up. And, yes, allowed through our democratic process, but he's still the sovereign God. And this is our king, our president, our leader. And what are we going to do? Are we going to continue in the grumbling spirit that we've built up for months and months and months leading up to the election? Are we going to continue to call names? Are we going to throw up our hands in despair and just say, okay, God, just send the apocalypse or something because this is just too bad to redeem? Or are we going to follow Paul's instructions? Paul, again, is asking Timothy and the church that Timothy's overseeing to pray for Nero. And if Paul, who would probably, from what we can tell, go on to be executed under Nero's regime, if Paul can say, pray for that man, pray for his government, pray for the Roman leaders who were the oppressors in the land, how much more can we go, okay, in a country where we are blessed to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion, in a country where we have been entrusted with a voice in who gets to govern it, and all of the benefits and the dangers that come with it. To be very clear, God raising up a leader, like we mentioned before, doesn't always mean this is a good leader, doesn't always mean it's going to be good news for the country. But the God who desires all to be saved, the God who gave his son to die for every one of the candidates standing for presidency, the God who will give all the kingdoms of this world to his son to rule and to reign forever, the God who wants to redeem the earth and who will, when it's all said and done, redeem the earth. Are we going to curse and grumble and resist the leaders that are being put in place, or are we going to pray that God does a miracle? We talked about Daniel 2 recently. If you look at the book of Daniel, Daniel has pretty significant spiritual breakthrough with Nebuchadnezzar, who is the guy who brought destruction on Jerusalem, took Daniel captive, forced him to be trained among other gods, tried to force his friends to worship other gods. Nebuchadnezzar was not a righteous king either. There was blood on his hands. And in chapter 4, you see Daniel counseling the king, giving him prophetic wisdom, prophesying in such a way that God uses him to bring clarity and sense to Nebuchadnezzar, so that when Nebuchadnezzar has his little episode out in the fields, he comes back a pretty changed man. Is that the same God we serve today, or what? The most ungodly, hard-hearted ruler can get shaken to the core by the God who knows their frame. The most godly ruler can be strengthened in righteousness and in wisdom to lead a nation. What if the candidate we dread the most got into office only to get radically touched by the Lord and it brings revival? What if a godly candidate comes to the forefront and brings their godly wisdom during this season? So we've got two things. Thing one, the man or woman who gets elected is not where the salvation for our country is. Our salvation for our country, our hope for our country is in the Lord and the Lord alone. So even as we're engaging with the political process, we need to remember where our hope lies, and we need to remember what we're praying for, because we want God to be moving on behalf of our nation, and we can't rely on a good candidate to accomplish it, and even the worst candidate can't derail it if God has his agenda on the table. Secondly, whoever gets elected, whether they are literally the best person who could ever take the reins of this country, or whether they are the biggest disaster we'll ever see in our lifetime, God commands us to pray for them. So I think that beyond just the commitment to pray for them when they are in office, which is good and important, I think even starting now, getting out of the habit of complaining and backbiting and tearing down the candidate and getting into the habit of, even as you're still pushing for your candidate to win, even as you're still engaging with what's going on. You don't have to pretend like, oh, they'll all be fine, they're all great people. You don't have to think that's true. Nero was not a great person. But we can have a prayerful attitude, we can have a humble attitude, and we can ask for God to meet them and to touch them and to give them wisdom and godliness and encounter with him, even in this primary season leading right up to the election. So between Daniel and 1 Timothy, I think we've got a real strong precedent to not just be those joining the reactionary pundits and opinions and noise about the elections, but we can latch onto the Lord in prayer for our nation, for our leaders, begin to do something really, truly, eternally productive in this election season and going forward with the direction of our country for the next 4, 8, 20, 50 years if the Lord tarries. So let's do it. Let's be intercessors. Let's pray for our country. Let's pray for these candidates. And when our next president is elected, let's pray for them as well. Let's pray for President Obama as he finishes out his term. And let's do it with a full heart that is trusting in the Lord and not anxious about man. I'm Amanda Beatty. This has been the Interwebercessor channel, and I will see you next week. Bye.